Hello! Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to all. Today I thought I'd make a fun little reaction video, and one video kinda stood out to me. Why I'm Not a Socialist by David Pakman. Fine, not a memey, PragerU
I want mommy, I want milk, I want to be held, I want to be comforted
video, but educational nonetheless. I'm unfamiliar with him, but this seems like the fabled social democratic theory spoken of only in legends, so let's take a look and have some fun. Slight preface, no hate towards this guy. I've just been sent this video a lot, so why not, I thought. Otherwise, like I said, I'm not really familiar with his political positions, let's say. Anyway, so he starts off by defining that he's a social democrat, and is for a socially guided market economy. Nothing too weird here. Let's see what else he has to say.
What's your position, David? And I've mentioned before that I'm not a socialist. I'm a social democrat in the sort of Nordic or Swedish tradition. And today I'm going to explain to you why I am not a socialist. And I'm happy to do this. It's something that's been an area of study for me since undergraduate and even including in graduate school.
This is something that stood out to me immediately. How have you been studying this for around half a decade and still not evolved past the most basic social democrat talking points? He seems to show an incomplete understanding as to why social democracies currently exist, and even further ignorance as to what currently sustains them.
Fundamentally, I'm not a socialist because I want an egalitarian, free, self-determining society. And that type of society will not emerge from authoritarian apparatus.
An egalitarian, free, self-determining society, Capitalism doesn't provide that, Habibi. Historically, it was the threat of socialist revolution that pushed egalitarian principles and political agendas to the forefront. The nonsense authority point is as wrong as it is boring at this point. Capitalism is an inherently authoritarian system. Getting kicked out of your job and being forced to be homeless on the street because you missed a rent payment or had a medical bill you couldn't pay apparently isn't authoritarian. Regardless, he probably would rebut, but social democracies have protective nets against these sort of things. Well, that's true in part, but where do you think the wealth for all that came from? Don't you think authoritarian means were used to secure the resources that allow for those safety nets? Firstly, many beacons of social democracy, like Britain and France, were massive imperial powers that built their wealth on the destruction of indigenous industry, colonial taxes, and the direct theft of the areas and peoples they've subjugated. Secondly, even those countries, like Norway, that didn't have direct empire still exploit the imperial periphery via unequal exchange and value transference. Companies in social democratic countries still take advantage of cheap immigrant labor at home and cheap imperial periphery labor abroad. They still rely on market preference via IMF restructuring of third-world economies that puts the core in advantage over the periphery. This is something made beautifully clear in the works of Zach Cope, John Smith, Intenso Wandi, and others, which I cannot recommend enough. Regardless, social democracy basically advocates for, rather than stripping the bourgeoisie of their unearned privilege and stolen wealth, we instead grovel at their feet for small concessions that they'll regally laud over you as some great self-sacrificing favor, despite the fact that workers, much like yourself, were the originators of all that wealth that's providing for those concessions in the first place.
And what that means is that at the national level, socialist and communist structures are fundamentally authoritarian, and at scale, enacting socialism or communism becomes authoritarian.
Repeating the same point, basically. It's a tired centrism. When the capitalist class does whatever it has to do in order to secure its wealth, power, and privilege, that's just how life is. But when a working class government does the same, it's all of a sudden authoritarian. Rules for thee, not for me, yada yada. If you're interested in a deeper dive into this, I made a video concerning authoritarianism you can check out here. Just know, authoritarianism is a two-way street. Socialists are just honest enough to admit that political aims may require authoritarian means, whatever those may be. Those that support capitalism also understand this, they just cover it up with sophistry and ideology in a limp attempt at seeming more respectable and reasonable, despite presiding over a system that has historically, as well as in the modern day, been far more barbaric than anything that's preceded it. Behind every nice-seeming social democrat is a neoliberal, or even worse, a fascist, why am I saying the same thing 3 times, that will bomb, murder, interfere, sabotage, and destroy in order to secure higher profits against the backdrop of token outrage from the oh-so-reasonable social democrats. Vietnam, Iraq, Grenada, history is my witness. Take a look at the works, late Victorian Holocausts, The Triumph of Evil, Killing Hope, or honestly any book on modern imperialism to see for yourself. Or hell, even Michael Parenti's Against Empire. Very highly recommended.
And a top example is Venezuela.
And here's why you shouldn't listen to what this guy has to say, by and large. Habibi, Venezuela is a social democratic country. They have made no serious attempts at surpassing capitalism, challenging the market, or even destroying the power of the capitalist class. There is no central plan. The working class doesn't hold sole political power. Private property hasn't been abolished. There is still wage labor. I can go on. I don't know how many times this needs to be said, but socialism isn't when the government does stuff, nor is it when a party has a socialist in the name. At the beginning of the video, he seems to understand this distinction, but when it comes to actual material realities, he's completely off the mark. Pakman's contention seems to boil down to not why I'm not a socialist, but more to why I prefer the social democracies of white European countries, completely devoid of any serious analysis. The reason Venezuela has been more quote-unquote authoritarian, a claim that needs to be heavily substantiated, mind you, is because it's under constant economic, diplomatic, and even at times military warfare by the largest superpower to ever exist, the United States. Unlike the Denmarks and Frances of the world that are allowed to develop more or less on their own, Venezuela is being pressured beyond belief, and as a result, they've had to combat, amongst other things, actual American coup attempts, assassination attempts, and CIA-sponsored riots in an artificial attempt to dislodge the current democratically elected leadership. This isn't even mentioning the economic aspect. He hand-waves this away as if it isn't a legitimate reason. If tomorrow Denmark was under the same pressure and took similar actions, guess who'd be there defending their actions? Not to play the racism card, but it really does kind of feel like that Peter Griffin meme. The whiter they are, the more okay it is.
Let's assume in good faith that the Chavez-Maduro goal was a truly egalitarian, free, thriving society. I don't know if it was, but let's be charitable, right? And they really did want that as the end goal. When you put aside the populist, collectivist rhetoric of that regime, the Venezuelan regime is an authoritarian imposition of government without all sorts of freedoms, lacking in press freedom, lacking in judicial freedom. It's a long list, and I'm opposed to it.
Oh boy, and capitalist countries abound on that, do they? Firstly, press and judicial freedom needs to be defined, and most of the time are nothing more than memes. Lenin has some fun words on this, so let's take a listen. For the bourgeoisie, freedom of the press means freedom for the rich to publish and for the capitalists to control the newspapers, a practice which in all countries, including even the freest, produced a corrupt press. All over the world, wherever there are capitalists, freedom of the press means freedom to buy up newspapers, to buy writers, to bribe, buy and fake public opinion for the benefit of the bourgeoisie. As ever, Lenin's words are prophetic, and a complete mirror of even modern times. I recommend you read the full publications, they're very short. Nonetheless, moving on.
And whatever their intentions were, their imposition of those intentions in this authoritarian way has led to absolute disaster. And some socialists, Leninists, will say that the opposition to the Venezuelan regime is American AstroTurf, or that the replacement to Maduro might be worse. Step back for a second. An authoritarian apparatus will not lead to an egalitarian, self-determining society, period.
This is an argument that needs to be substantiated, again. By our own strange definitions, Cuba is authoritarian, but has indeed resulted in an egalitarian, self-determining society. In contrast, many of the social democracies of Europe have highly rising inequality, and their ability to self-determine their politics is laughable, to say the least. Politics in social democracies are like every other capitalist country. The rich will try as hard as they can, and 99 out of 100 times will succeed in getting their demands met. This is not an anomaly of the system, it's a feature. Is this willful ignorance on his part? I'm genuinely unsure.
But for today, we're talking about modern socialist theory, and that dates back roughly to about the 1800s. And there are three main lines of socialist theory.
Oh, has he read Engels? I'm assuming not. Let's hopefully be pleasantly surprised.
Almost no one who likes to talk about socialism on the internet actually knows about this stuff. This is really important. This is the nuts and bolts.
I'm sorry, what? Firstly, this is literally 101 stuff. Don't impose your own company's lack of knowledge on these subjects on everyone else. But secondly, I'm fairly confident you'll get your classifications at least a little confused, so I don't even know why I try, honestly. TLDR of these few upcoming minutes, utopians, anarchists, and Marxist-Leninists are the three trends of socialism according to him, which is strange, I guess. He's mixing up three different time frames, and I personally wouldn't break it up this way, but for a quick rundown, I guess it's alright. He seems to be open to utopian ideas applying to modern nations, which is unsurprising. Bonus points to him, though, because he realizes that the most dominant and common trend of socialism in the current era is Marxism-Leninism, which is an established fact. Democratic socialists, De-Leonists, Trad-Cath fanboys, and pretty much every other niche trend barely exist in the imperial core, and practically don't exist in the imperial periphery, or exist as infinitely small groupings, mostly on the internet. That's not meant as offense to anyone who identifies as such, but when dealing with material realities, we have to look at the facts. Nonetheless, then he goes on to explain the labor theory of value decently enough, and says he likes it. But then he says this.
The problem is I don't believe the ultimate solution to that identification is the end stage of capitalism with a Marxist revolution. That's not what I see as the long-term solution.
So ending the capitalist system isn't the solution. Instead, let's stay in a system predicated on infinite growth on a finite planet, but with more free healthcare and gay prison guards. I swear liberals really are something else.
What previously had been sort of a cohesive movement, but with different approaches, utopianism, anarchism, Marxism, Leninism.
Our movement has never been cohesive, but whatever. Have you read Marx's letters?
And this gets to one of my fundamental oppositions to socialism's view of the distributions of outcomes versus social democracies. Socialism in the Marxist, Leninist sort of tradition is simply not aligned with the realities of human distribution.
Oh boy, is this really a Muh Hooman Nature argument? I thought you said you studied this for years, man. What is this?
Because when we look at human endeavors, they have unequal distribution. If you look at athletic ability and how it's distributed, if you look at linguistic proficiency, if you look at business success, if you look at human height, human weight, it's all distributed on a curve. And on the one hand, where socialism wants to level out the distribution in a way that I've not seen evidence can actually be achieved without significant downsides, what social democracy wants to do is tweak that distribution, lower the absolute top, raise the bottom a little bit, and then reduce the gap between the very bottom and the very top. You're sort of leveling it out. You're raising the mean and reducing the difference between top and bottom.
Oh, alright, disappointed but not surprised. Let's quote some Lenin, shall we? I've quoted his publication titled A Liberal Professor on Equality many times, but it seems it still isn't enough. The quote is long, but Lenin's hilarious, so bear with it, timestamp, blah blah. This is the reasoning of a liberal scholar who repeats the incredibly trite and threadbare argument that experience and reason clearly prove that men are not equal, yet socialism bases its ideal on equality. Hence, socialism, if you please, is an absurdity, which is contrary to experience and reason and so forth. Mr. Tugan, maybe Mr. Pakman in this case, repeats the old trick of the reactionaries, first to misinterpret socialism by making it out to be an absurdity, and then to triumphantly refute that absurdity. When we say that experience and reason proves that men are not equal, we mean by equality in abilities, or similarity in physical strength and mental ability. It goes without saying that in this respect, men are not equal. No sensible person and no socialist forgets this, but this kind of equality has nothing whatsoever to do with socialism. If Mr. Tugin is unable to think, he is at least able to read the well-known works of one of the founders of scientific socialism, Friedrich Engels. Directed against Dühring, he would find there a special section explaining the absurdity of imagining that economic equality means anything else than the abolition of classes. But when professors set out to refute socialism, one never knows what to wonder at most, their stupidity, their ignorance, or their unscrupulousness. By political equality, Marxists mean equal rights, and by economic equality, as we've already said, they mean the abolition of classes. As for establishing human equality in the sense of equality of strength and abilities, physical and mental, socialists do not even think of such things. Political equality is a demand for equal political rights for all citizens of a country who have reached a certain age and who do not suffer from either ordinary or liberal professorial feeble-mindedness. The entire write-up is lovely, I highly suggest you go read it, but Lenin's TLDR point is this. Socialists want the abolition of classes and political equality, meaning equal rights. No one even mentions height differences or charisma or whatever. These are all straw men of socialism advanced by those that either don't understand socialism or have critiques so weak that they need to invent lies in order to have something to refute. As for his bringing the rich and poor closer together, reducing equality, blah 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 point, well, it's moot because inequality is rising in pretty much every single social democratic country in Europe. So much for that, right? He goes on to sing the praises of social democracy despite missing the fundamental analysis of capitalism in a concessionary stage. The only reason social democracies rose was because the USSR was right next door, providing all those same social safeties and more. The second it was gone, the ruling class got to dismantling. Capitalists always want and need higher profits, so concessions will eventually be stripped away. Capitalism is an untenable system due to boom and bust cycles, environmental impact, the senseless pursuit of never-ending profit, perpetual unemployment in the form of a reserve army of labor, the falling rate of profit, imperialism. I can go on for much longer. Check out my relevant videos on why capitalism sucks and why socialism is superior here. He has this point he repeats on socially guided market economy a lot. Doesn't he realize that only profits guide markets? I mean, Vietnam is kind of an example to the contrary, at times, with a lot more nuance I don't have the energy to put in here, but I doubt he's advocating for that system. If it came down to make a profit and provide no safety net versus make a loss and provide a safety net, which do you think the capitalist-dominated social democracies would choose? The first, obviously, and not because they're cartoon villains, but because the capitalist economic system is built atop profit solely. If profit isn't made, the economy collapses and there will no longer be a state to provide that safety net. He also says free education means you can go study wherever you want, as if a job market isn't a thing in social democracies and people wouldn't be forced to enter professions that will have a decent salary as compared to passions that tend to be more creative and worse paying. This stuff is tiring because their analysis is just so good-hearted, I guess, and naive. It's just a shame they haven't realized they're wrong. Yet.
Now, here's where the critique actually defends social democracy over socialism. A totally socialist society, whether Marxist or utopian or anarchist or Leninist in the US, would actually be impossible.
Differentiating Marxist and Leninist is essentially pointless because I can assure you he's probably not aware of the nuances, entirely irrelevant in the modern era, between the two in a theoretical sense, but this also requires substantiating. Why is it impossible? Because revolution as you see it currently isn't likely? To quote the lovely Luxemburg, before revolution happens, it is perceived as impossible. After it happens, it is seen as having been inevitable. This is a work in progress, not something that falls from the sky. This is why agitation, organization, parties, etc. exist. The democratic capitalist revolutions also took tireless work, and royals and aristocrats of the time similarly held the vain and mistaken belief that they wouldn't ever be successful until they were.
But what wouldn't be impossible would be socializing certain elements of American society.
This, yet again, also needs to be substantiated. Attempts at socializing healthcare and education have been going on for decades in the US with no success in sight. Doesn't mean it's impossible, no, and especially if revolutionary rhetoric becomes more popular, the ruling class will change their tune real quick. That's basically the entire story with FDR and the New Deal, but again, socializing healthcare would be a concession that would be stripped at the edges slowly as working class movements weaken, like in every other instance in European social democratic history. I can recommend you some literature, Habibi. Just a cursory glance through The Communist Necessity by Muh et al. Would answer a lot of these questions for you.
One other argument from the right, which is they say it works in Sweden because Sweden is small and the US is big. That's part of why I believe that total socialism actually is not the path forward, but that there are socializable components which would work absolutely fine in the United States.
Big means socialism, no work, is not an argument. The USSR was absolutely massive and had to do with a lot less, and still managed to do a pretty good job. Modern technology, communications, computers, and the internet would definitely make even more possible in the modern era.
So to sort of give you the highlights of why I'm not a socialist and I am a social democrat, I believe that a socially directed market economy that reduces income inequality and ensures a real standard of living for everybody is more realistic, and it's also more in line with human nature.
So, reason number one is I'm not up to date on income inequality statistics in modern social democracies, and a strawman argument of socialism debunked over a century ago. Color me surprised.
And I fundamentally, and this gets back to the real reason that I so vehemently oppose what we see going on in Venezuela and what we see and have seen in other places around the world, I do not believe, because I've seen no evidence, that an egalitarian, self-determining, free society will develop from an authoritarian apparatus, period.
You just haven't done the reading, that's all you said. The entire framing is wrong because it presupposes that social democratic capitalism is free and egalitarian, which is a mistaken belief already discussed. Check out my Problems of the Western Left video if you're still interested. Otherwise, you've already revealed to us that you're not the most educated on the topic of socialism, no shame in that. But that leads me to not have any reason to believe you'd be any more qualified to comment on socialist history or its conditions. This is less a concrete position on the superiority of social democracy and more a comforting ignorance draped in impotent appeals to precarious systems under no external pressure, unlike historic and current socialisms which were and have never been allowed to develop on their own terms. He signs off by saying he's open to dialogue. Well, so am I. If you're down, David, I'll at you and we can see if we can make something of a conversation on this topic going into the future.